It began with a blue light, not a soft, welcoming glow, but a brilliant, violet blue beam that pierced the Ukrainian night sky, reaching kilometers into the atmosphere. To the residents of Pripyat, it looked like a searchlight, perhaps a beautiful atmospheric phenomenon. In reality, it was the soundless scream of a dying world. It was ionizing radiation so intense, it was literally tearing the air apart. But 3 kilometers away, inside the control room of Reactor Unit 4, the men who had just unleashed this light were still in a state of shock. They were looking at dials that shouldn't exist and hearing alarms that signaled the end of everything they knew. This is the story of the Chernobyl catastrophe. Not just the explosion, but the invisible storm that followed. A storm of radiation, secrets, and a biological betrayal that would haunt Europe for generations. To understand how the world's worst nuclear disaster happened, we have to go back to the afternoon of April 25th, 1986. It was a beautiful, warm day in the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant was the pride of the empire. A labyrinth of steel and graphite promised to provide limitless energy. Reactor number 4 was scheduled for a routine safety test. The goal was simple. If the power went out, could the spinning turbines provide enough electricity to keep the cooling pumps running for just 60 seconds until the backup generators kicked in? It was a test of survival, but the test was delayed. The Kiev grid controller needed power for the afternoon rush, forcing the reactor to stay online at half power for 10 grueling hours. In the world of nuclear physics, delay is a poison. As the reactor sat at low power, a byproduct of fission called xenon-135 began to build up inside the core. Scientists call this xenon poisoning. Xenon acts like a sponge, soaking up the neutrons needed to keep the reaction alive. By the time the night shift took over at midnight, the reactor was choking. It was unstable, unpredictable, and dying. The men in the control room, shift supervisor Alexander Akimov and 25-year-old Leonid Toptunov, found themselves fighting a ghost. When they tried to lower the power for the test, it plummeted almost to zero. Standard procedure was to shut the reactor down for 24 hours to let the xenon decay. But Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, a man known for his iron-fisted leadership, reportedly refused to stop. He ordered them to bring the power back up. To do this, they had to pull the brakes, the boron carbide control rods, almost entirely out of the core. Out of 211 rods, they left only 6 or 8 inside. The reactor was now like a race car, with the throttle pinned to the floor, held back only by the invisible weight of the xenon gas. At 1:23 a.m., the test began. They shut off the steam. The cooling pumps slowed. As the water flow dropped, steam bubbles, or voids, began to form in the core. In the RBMK reactor's design, this was a fatal flaw known as a positive void coefficient. More steam meant more reactivity. More reactivity meant more heat, and more heat meant more steam. The reactor began to accelerate. Leonid Toptunov saw the power surging and reached for the emergency button, AZ5. This was meant to drop all the control rods back into the core and stop the reaction instantly. But the RBMK had one final hidden secret. The control rods were tipped with graphite. For the first few seconds of insertion, that graphite didn't stop the reaction. It accelerated it. Instead of a brake, the safety button became a detonator. Inside reactor number 4, the energy levels spiked to more than 100 times its rated capacity in a heartbeat. The fuel rods shattered. The cooling water flashed into steam with such violent pressure that it blew the 1,000-ton steel lid, affectionately called Elena by the workers, straight through the roof of the building. Seconds later, a second explosion scattered burning graphite and nuclear fuel across the facility. The core was open to the sky. The immediate aftermath was a scene of surreal carnage. Valery Khodemchuk, a pump operator, was killed instantly, his body forever entombed in the ruins. Outside, the first responders arrived within minutes. Firefighters from Pripyat, led by Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, were told they were fighting a simple roof fire. They climbed onto the roof of the turbine hall, stepping directly onto chunks of burning reactor graphite. They weren't wearing lead suits. They were in shirt sleeves and standard tunics. As they worked, they began to notice a strange, metallic taste in their mouths, a prickly sensation on their skin. skin. They were being cooked from the inside out by radiation fields so intense that Pravik's eyes reportedly turned from brown to blue. Back in the control room, Akimov and Toptonov were in a state of total denial. They believed the reactor was still intact. For hours, they stood in knee-deep radioactive water, manually opening valves to pump water into a core that no longer existed. Their skin began to turn a deep reddish brown, the nuclear tan. Akimov would die 2 weeks later. His body was so radioactive that he had to be buried in a lead-lined coffin with the lid welded shut. While the plant burned, the city of Pripyat, a model city of 50,000 people just 3 kilometers away, continued to sleep. When the sun rose on Saturday morning, it was a beautiful, hot spring day. There was no warning, no sirens. Children walked to school for their Saturday lessons. They played in the sandboxes while radioactive dust, invisible and odorless, settled on their hair and clothes. People walked to the local market. On the streets, a strange white foam appeared, the result of early, desperate decontamination efforts, but the citizens were told it was just a steam discharge. In the Policia Hotel, a wedding was taking place. Irina and Sergei Lobanov were celebrating their marriage. The guests danced and drank lemonade, even as the wind carried a plume of isotopes directly over the balcony where Sergei's Komsomol bosses watched the horizon. It wasn't until 36 hours after the explosion that the announcement finally came over the radio.
"For the attention of the residents of Pripyat," the voice said, "an unsatisfactory radiation situation has occurred. We need to temporarily evacuate. Bring only essentials. You will return in 3 days."
It was a lie. 1,100 buses arrived in a line that stretched for miles. People left warm meals on their tables. They left their pets barking behind locked doors. They left their lives, thinking they'd be back by Tuesday. Most never saw their homes again. As the city became a ghost town, the Soviet Union began a massive liquidation effort. Nearly 600,000 people were mobilized: soldiers, miners, and engineers. They were sent into a hellscape. When the radio-controlled robots sent to clear the roof of the adjacent Unit 3 failed because the radiation fried their electronics, the military turned to bio-robots, human beings. These men wore improvised lead suits made from sheets stripped from office walls. Their shifts lasted only 90 seconds. They would run onto the roof, shovel 1 load of radioactive graphite into the gaping maw of the reactor, and run back. In those 90 seconds, they received a lifetime's worth of radiation. Deep in the bowels of the ruins, something even more terrifying was forming. The molten fuel had mixed with sand and concrete, flowing like lava into the maintenance corridors. When researchers finally found it, they called it the elephant's foot. It was a mass of black corium, so radioactive that upon its discovery, spending just 300 seconds near it was a death sentence. But perhaps the most haunting part of the Chernobyl story isn't the explosion or the machines, it's the people who refused to leave. Years after the disaster, a small group of elderly women, the babushkas of Chernobyl, began to sneak back into the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. They had survived Stalin's man-made famine in the 30s and the Nazi occupation in the 40s. To them, radiation was just another invisible enemy. "Starvation is what scares me, not radiation," said Hanna Zavarotina, who still lives in her cottage, growing potatoes in contaminated soil and brewing moonshine. These women became the final human heartbeat of the zone. Surprisingly, studies showed they often outlived the people who were evacuated to the city. Scientists believe the trauma of relocation, the loss of their motherland, was more lethal than the radiation itself. Today, the exclusion zone is a poisoned paradise. In the absence of humans, nature has reclaimed the concrete. Wolves, brown bears, and Eurasian lynx roam the abandoned streets of Pripyat. Endangered Przewalski's horses have formed stable herds among the ruins of the Soviet dream. Nature is thriving, but it is nature with a cost. Frogs in the zone have developed darker skin to shield themselves from the lingering toxicity. Chernobyl remains a wound that has not healed. In 2022, the site briefly became a battlefield again during the Russian invasion as troops dug trenches in the highly radioactive Red Forest, reportedly falling ill from the dust they disturbed.
disturbed. The disaster was a tragedy of physics, yes, but more than that, it was a tragedy of the human spirit. It was the cost of lies. It was the price of a system that valued secrecy over safety and quotas over lives. As the sun sets over the Ferris wheel in Pripyat, a wheel that never carried a single child, we are reminded that the invisible storm is still there. Reactor 4 is entombed under a massive arch of steel, but the elephant's foot still sits in the darkness, thermally hot and lethally radioactive, a monument to the night the atom broke its chains. The workers in the control room thought they were saving the reactor. They didn't realize that by the time they pressed the button, the world they knew had already turned to ash.